throughout presentation. I will go directly into my talk. Understanding the world as God's creation is arguably at the heart of the Qur'anic message and an important subject of Islamic theological reflection. Instead of referring to God's actions in history, the Qur'an repeatedly points to the well-made creation as God's greatest miracle, in which signs for the convinced, as one verse puts it, can be found. Muslim kalām theologians who later sought to elaborate the oneness of God, tawḥīd, as the central foundation of belief, thus first turned to establishing the existence of the Creator. In that sense, even the first part of the Islamic statement of faith, I testify that there is no God but God, was understood as particularly referring to God's oneness as Creator. On a different note, the importance of the concept of creation for Muslim self-interpretation and the interpretation of the world is certainly related to the fact that in the Islamic tradition, God's decision to create is perceived as a willful act of divine self-revelation. In Sufi texts, for example, the Mathnawi of Jalaluddin Rumi or the writings of Mullah Sadra, a well-known, though not uncontroversial hadith is frequently quoted or at least alluded to. God says, I was a hidden treasure, kanzan makhfiyan, and I love to be known. So I created the creation in order to be known. So this hadith was already referred to a couple of minutes ago. Less controversial, but nevertheless close in meaning, is an interpretation of Surah 51, verse 56, which can be found in the exegesis of the 14th century scholar Ibn Kathir. The famous verse, I created the jinn and humankind only that they might worship me, is to be understood in the sense of only that they might know me. In what follows, I would like to first take a closer look at the concept of creation in the Qur'an as the primary Islamic text of reference, and then delineate some of the main lines of thought within the systematic theological tradition of kalām. For the Qur'an, I choose a historical contextualizing approach based primarily on the contextualization of verses within their chronology and the environment of their revelation on the 7th century Arabian Peninsula. For the kalām tradition, I focus on Sunni texts from the 10th and 11th century, that is the so-called classical period, in which for the first time, comprehensive systematic theological texts were composed that cover all the individual problems discussed by earlier theologians.
Professor Sievers, okay.
Sorry?
I was just wondering if you wanted to show us other folio.
Yes, I want. I prepared 8 beautiful folios for you.
Okay.
And I think you'll see them starting from now.
Oh, all right. Okay.
So don't worry, it won't stay with only this one word on the slide. There's more. So let us first look at what the Qur'an says about creation. The Qur'an as a whole does not contain one uniform concept of creation, but in the course of revelation, an initial concept is first introduced, then unfolded for quite some time, before it is fully developed at about the beginning of the so-called Medinan period. The primary words used for creation in the Qur'an are derived from the Arabic root kha lam qaf, which occurs a total of 261 times in the Qur'an. This includes both the verbal form and several nominal forms, with khaliq, creator, and khalq, creation, probably being the most important ones. In ancient Arabic poetry, the root did not yet primarily designate creation, but rather aims at the idea of shaping something in very different contexts, like a piece of clothing or a piece of leather. In the Qur'an, the idea of creation is also expressed by a number of other words in addition to this root, some of them coming from the older religions, for example, al-Fatir, creator, which could have an Ethiopian Christian origin, or al-Bari, which probably derives from Syriac. Other verbs refer to specific kinds of giving a form within the act of creation, such as sawwa, for forming human beings evenly, bana, for building the heavens and the earth, or sataha, for flattening the earth. If we now look at the oldest surahs of the Qur'an, that is those of the early Meccan period, creation, with the word khalq, is introduced as that action of God observable in the present, by which human beings are created from an initial material. The focus is here on continued creation, creatio continua, in contrast to creation as the origin of the world. As creatures, it is humans in particular who are at the center of the statements about creation with that root. At the same time, humans are also the addressees of the Quranic speech. Overall, the early Meccan surahs give the impression that they primarily want to convince man of his own createdness, from which he should draw consequences for his faith and actions. The creation of the wider world is also mentioned, but described with other words, such as the ones just mentioned, so not by the root khalaqa. The centrality of man as the addressee of the Quranic revelation does not mean that he is also perceived as the center of creation. In passages like a longer one in Surah 56, it can be seen that all natural processes are understood as ultimately being brought about by God. The creation of man, therefore, does not appear as a special action that is different from other natural processes, but it stands on an equal footing with the rest of God's creative action. The various things created and processes brought about by God are all dependent on his comprehensive power. Precisely in this, they are also connected with each other. In the surahs of the second period, that is the Middle Meccan period, the earlier concept of creation is expanded and deepened. Above all, the focus is placed on the full scope and extent of creation. There is no longer a clear emphasis on the bringing into being of humans, but on the creation of the world as a whole, namely the heavens and the earth as samawat wal ard, as a now frequent phrase puts it. Thus, the biblical wording, hashamayim v'ha'aretz, is taken up and rendered in Arabic. Furthermore, also in accordance with the biblical conception and with reference to post-biblical material, the view is directed from the continued creation in the present to the beginning of the six-day original creation, the creatio prima. It is only now that protology, in the sense of the first things, in my understanding, becomes a theme of Islamic scripture. God's creation now culminates in the creation and formation of the first human being, Adam, and his partner, which is told several times in the Middle Meccan surahs in the context of the Adam-Iblīs narrative. The creation of man is now presented as a particularly intimate act, emphasized by God creating the human being with his two hands, biyadayya, and blowing into him from his spirit, nafakhtu fihi min ruhi. The children of Adam, that is humanity as a whole, are now explicitly described as being honored by God. The Middle Meccan surahs emphasize how easy creation is for God. He is not fatigued by it and will eschatologically be able to create it a second time. It is stressed that God alone can be the creator, that there is therefore no other God besides him, an explicit reference to the earlier mentioned belief in the oneness of God, tawḥīd, within the context of creation. Furthermore, God created everything in the right way, bil-haq, thus taking up the idea of midrashic literature that God created the world according to a wise blueprint that is in a rationally understandable way. God has precise knowledge of the characteristics of man, whom he created in haste, min ajal, and who all too often proves to be a clearly recognizable adversary, khasim mubin. Thus, despite his honoring by God, he remains a morally questionable creature. In the late Meccan surahs, creation as a whole, as well as as its individual components, are repeatedly referred to as signs, ayat. In addition to the verses of the Qur'an, which were already described with the same word earlier, a separate revelatory character is now attributed to nature. What is more, God is concisely described as the creator of all things, khaliq kull shay. The negative qualities of human beings continue to be mentioned at this stage, such as his quarrelsomeness and forgetfulness. A well-known verse introduces the idea of a human disposition towards God, fitra. Man seems to fulfill all the necessary conditions to attain true knowledge of the Creator and to draw the right consequences from it. The intimate attention that God paid to the first creation of man, which was described in the Middle Meccan surahs, now appears more clearly to be a privilege. Not only are the children of Adam honored, but the animals and birds, and finally all that is in the heavens and the earth, God has made subservient to man. In the late Meccan surahs, this idea thus results in a form of hierarchy within creation that places humans above the rest of nature. In the latest surahs, those of the Medinan period, there is little overall development with regard to the Qur'anic theology of creation. The in the Meccan surahs developed concept is essentially presupposed and forms the background for discussions of other themes in which occasional reference is made to it. However, the chronologically last version of the Adam-Iblīs narrative, in that narrative, there is a significant change of emphasis in the description of the creation of man. It is now preceded by a dialogue between God and the angels. I will quote it. Prophet, when your Lord told the angels, I am placing a vicegerent on earth, they said, how can you put someone there who will cause damage and bloodshed when we celebrate your praise and proclaim your holiness? But he said, I know things you do not. He taught Adam all the names of things and then showed them to the angels and said, tell me the names of these if you truly think you can. They said, may you be glorified. We have knowledge only of what you have taught us. You are the all-knowing and all-wise. Then he said, Adam, tell us the names of these. When he told them their names, God said, did I not tell you that I know what is hidden in the heavens and the earth, and that I know what you reveal and what you conceal? The angels react skeptically to God's announcement to appoint man as vicegerent on earth, fearing that he will bring ruin, fasad, to it, an understandable expectation in view of man's earlier described tendencies towards evil. God, however, announces that he will appoint man anyway, and refers to a special knowledge that would enable him to perform his task as vicegerent. In this narrative, the Qur'an presumably takes up a Talmudic tradition, but modifies it in order to bring it into conversation with the earlier Qur'anic versions of the Adam-Iblīs narrative. Since the Middle Meccan surahs, the idea increasingly emerged of a human privilege in creation, first described as a special honoring, then further stressed by characterizing other creatures as being subservient to man. the repeatedly emphasized morally ambivalent nature of man with his tendency to act wickedly, thus stands in a certain tension with this special place in creation. In the just seen narrative, in the earliest Medinan surah, it's precisely the human freedom to do good or evil that appears to be the necessary condition for the special task of being a vicegerent, a khalifa, and it is this freedom which distinguishes humans from angels. Although those, the angels, should ultimately be right that man brings ruin upon the world, it is his persisting potential to positively assume his responsibility that brings him into a special closeness to God. Many aspects of the importance of the concept of creation can thus be traced back to the Qur'an. But in order to see the bigger picture, other traditions need to be included. And here I want to see how the Quranic concept was dealt with in the later theological tradition. Kalām is the discipline traditionally understood as theology in the narrower sense. Creation plays a central role here, even though there is no separate section on creation theology in these texts, in the texts of the classical period. Rather, the topic of creation is treated in the context of several other problems, especially the question of the argument for the existence of the creator, in the discussion of divine attributes, and in the area of eschatology, where the resurrection of the dead is understood as a new creation. Let us first turn to the argument for the existence of God. The two central beliefs that are justified in classical Kalām theology within this chapter are the temporal origination of the world, hudūth al-alam, and the existence of an originator, ithbat as-sani'. In other words, it is about proving that the world is created and God is its creator, a central insight of Quranic theology, as we have seen. In Kalām texts, this would also imply the notion of creatio ex nihilo, which cannot be explicitly found in the Qur'an. The language used, however, is a very different one. Whereas in the Qur'an, the word khalq primarily denoted creation, in the Kalām ihdath, temporal origination, or ijad, bringing into existence, describes this divine act. The standard argument is the well-known Kalām cosmological argument, which is used in most Mu'tazili, Ash'ari, and Maturidi texts, and which can be reconstructed in its basic structure as follows. The world is temporally originated. Everything that is temporally originated requires an originator. Therefore, the world requires an originator. While the first premise, the world is temporally originated, is usually elaborated at length in one chapter, the actual conclusion about the creator follows in a separate section. The main argument is based on an atomistic worldview. Everything around us consists of substances and accidents, some of which are composed into bodies. Since the 8th century, cosmological discussions in the Muslim world were very much influenced by late antique Hellenistic philosophy. Different groups, which the Muslims called the materialists, Dahri, or the godless, mulhid, agreed in denying the creation of the world out of nothing. Confronting these godless cosmologies, to use Patricia Crone's term, the early Kalām theologians had to develop an alternative cosmology that would do justice to Islamic beliefs on creation. In this sense, an actualization takes place in the Kalām texts. The Quranic concepts are expressed in the language of philosophically informed scholars of the 10th century Muslim world. Creation also plays a role in the discussion of divine attributes. The question here is, what can be said about God's essence or attribute after it is proven that he created the world out of nothing? While for Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites, it is his power of autonomous action, qudra, the Maturidis additionally assume a separate attribute of creation, takween. At the heart of the Kalam theologians' argument is an analogy to the visible world. Mu'tazilites argue that beings for which actions, af'al, are possible, sahha, are capable of autonomous action, qadir. This would also apply to God, for whom actions are proven to be possible in the form of the existing creation. The Ash'arites infer God's power directly from the argument for the existence of God. According to them, it is a priori knowledge, and badihi, not requiring further justification, that actions can only be performed by beings capable of autonomous action. The Maturidi theologians explicitly state the equivalence of the Qur'anic term khalq with the kalam terminology of ijad and ihdath, and define creation as bringing the non-existent into existence. Since the world is created by God, one would have to affirm a divine attribute of creation, takwin, different from God's power of autonomous action. Only through the interaction of both attributes, creation takes place. Along these lines, they also interpret Qur'anic verses like the one in which God said, "Be" to the world, whereupon it came into existence. God's addressing the world by his creative speech would be equivalent with his attribute of creation. Finally, the Kalam tradition also discusses God's eschatological creation, which echoes the Qur'anic terminology of a repetition of the first creation. According to Joseph van Es, the Kalam discussions can be read as a scientification of Qur'anic theology of creation, as they are entirely based on the theoretical and cosmological background of 10th and 11th century Kalam theology. This includes considerations of the theory of action, as well as the preconditions for the recreation of substances, accidents, and bodies. Especially the modality of statements about the repetition of creation is of major importance here. The most basic category is that of mere conceivability, jawaz. The Ash'arites in particular, and for the most part also the Maturidis, consider the proof of the conceivability of recreation to be the central task of Kalam within the section of eschatology. Their core argument following the Qur'an is based on the first creation. Since it was already possible, sahha, for God to create the world out of nothing, it must continue to be possible for him. In order to then justify the actuality of recreation in the future, the Ash'arites and many Maturidis refer to scriptural evidence. The Mu'tazilites, as well as some Maturidis, discuss whether it might be morally necessary, wajib, for God to recreate human beings. As it is often the case in Kalam, it is the primary principles, the usul of the schools of theology, that tip the balance in one direction. While Ash'arites proceed strongly from their emphasis on God's all-encompassing power, qudra, and his freedom of choice, the Mu'tazilites stress God's justice as a principle of religion, according to which God must justly reward human beings for their good acts or compensate them for their suffering, as he promised. I come to my conclusion. The importance of the concept of creation in Islam can be traced back to the Qur'an, starting from the earliest surahs, which primarily sought to convince the first hearers of their createdness. The Qur'an develops a sophisticated theology of creation that particularly reflects on the position of human beings in the totality of creation. Here, the emphasis is on humans being honored and privileged by God because of their potential to do both good and evil, which entails a special responsibility. In the post-Quranic period, the classical Kalam theologians vindicated the principles of Quranic theology of creation in their context. Based on a worldview influenced by the Hellenistic philosophy of late antiquity, they developed an understanding of creatio ex nihilo that is elaborated on in both the argument for the existence of God, as well as the discussion of the divine attributes. Following the Qur'an, also eschatology is essentially conceived as a repetition of God's creation. In the present, the subject of creation continues to be of great importance for Muslims as well as for Jews and Christians. However, in view of advanced scientific knowledge in modernity, contemporary physical cosmology, and the theory of evolution, the question increasingly arises what exactly the Qur'anic creation narratives are aiming at and what they actually explain. Similar to what the kalām theologians did in the classical period, Muslim theologians today have to reinterpret Islamic theological beliefs in the present context. This will arguably include reinterpretations of mythological elements in the Quranic creation narratives. However, the at the beginning mentioned interpretation of the self and the world in the light of the oneness of God remains important for a contemporary Muslim understanding of the concept of creation. That is, that everything that exists shares the quality of being created by the one creator. Thank you very much.